On April 29, 1945, at a gas station in Milan, they hanged two bodies upside down. Passers-by spat on them. They kicked them. Someone emptied their pistol into one of them, already a corpse. The man who had promised to rebuild the Roman Empire, the one who had called himself heir to the Caesars, the one who had brandished the destiny of 40 million Italians as if it were his personal property, ended up swinging before a mob that hated him with the same intensity with which they had once adored him. This is the story of fascist Italy. 23 years of an experiment that began with a socialist blacksmith and a rebel boy in a village of Romagna and ended at a gas station with a partisan bullet and a name that the world would forever associate with failure and ruin. The Blacksmith's Son, the origin of a dictator. In the summer of 1890, in the small village of Dovia, belonging to the municipality of Predappio in the Romagna region, a 7-year-old boy received a punch in the mouth from a boy named Orsi Giacona, 3 years older than him. The boy fell among the vines with a bleeding lip and eyes moist with humiliation. He returned home crying, and his father, Alessandro Mussolini, a blacksmith with black hands and an explosive temperament, pinned him against the wall with a fist. "Tears are for women," he growled at him, and then, "Go back and teach him that nobody touches a Mussolini." The boy went back. He found a pointed stone on the road, picked it up and struck Orsi twice in the ear and once in the mouth until the older boy fled screaming. That night, the father applauded the son with the force of a hammer on an anvil. Benito Mussolini was 7 years old and had already learned the first lesson of his life, violence as a response to the world. He was born on July 29th, 1883. His name was chosen by his father, Alessandro, a man obsessed with revolutionary politics and the idols of international socialism. He named him Benito in honor of Benito Juarez, the Mexican reformer who had defied the empire. Alessandro Mussolini was not just any village blacksmith. He had spent 3 years in prison for his activities alongside the anarchists who followed the Russian Mikhail Bakunin, and had been the first union organizer in all of Italy. His forge in Dovia was also an informal political club where workers arrived at night to listen to debates on Marx, Bakunin and Mazzini, while the fire of the forge illuminated the conversations of men with red necks and Garibaldi caps. Rosa Mussolini, the mother, was the exact opposite. An elementary school teacher, a devout Catholic, silent and patient. She taught classes on the floor above the forge, while the hammer resounded on the floor, and Alessandro argued politics, shouting with the neighbors. The 3 children, Benito, Arnaldo, and Edviga, grew up between the roar of the anvil and the catechism lessons, between the father's furious atheism and the mother's serene faith. Benito was the most difficult. His own autobiography recognizes it without shame. He was restless, unable to stay still, prone to fights. They sent him to the Salesian boarding school in Faenza when he was 9 years old, and within 2 years they had expelled him for stabbing a classmate in the arm who had called him anarchist trash. The director of the friars, exhausted, wrote in the file, "His soul is black as hell." Alessandro welcomed him home with pride. His son had not bowed before the priests. The second school, the Folimpopoli Magistral Institute, was more permissive. The director was Valfredo Carducci, brother of the great poet Giosuè Carducci. There, Benito showed a sudden and fierce intelligence when he wanted to. In 1901, he achieved the highest grades in the final exams of the entire history of the institute and graduated with an elementary school teacher's diploma. He was 18 years old and had no job. The municipality of Predappio rejected his candidacy as municipal clerk. The conservative mayor considered him too young and dangerous, a dangerous socialist, like his father. Alessandro Mussolini went personally to insult the mayor. Young Benito took a temporary job as a teacher in Gualtieri, on the banks of the Po. It lasted a year. The village mayor fired him for his fights with local youths and his inappropriate behavior. It was his first job, and the first one he lost. In May 1902, without work, without money, and with barely the courage he himself identified as his only capital, he crossed the border into Switzerland. Lausanne's Vagabond, Switzerland and the Forging of Character. He arrived in Switzerland with little more than the clothes on his back and a medal of Karl Marx that he carried in his pocket as a talisman. What he found was humiliation. Italians were cheap and despised labor in the Swiss Confederation. He worked as a laborer on a construction site near Orbe, loading wheelbarrows of stones on an 11-hour shift under a merciless sun, with raw hands and blistered feet. At the end of the week, the contractor paid him 20 lire instead of the 30 agreed upon. "Consider that I've already stolen them from you," he told him. Mussolini did not reply. He bought a pair of nailed shoes and left. In Lausanne, without money and without work, he slept under the Grand Bridge for days. One morning, delirious with hunger, he snatched lunch from the hands of 2 English tourists eating on a bench: bread, cheese, eggs. "If they had protested," he admitted years later in his autobiography, "I probably would have strangled them. I was so desperate from hunger that I had almost lost my senses." They arrested him as a vagabond, and he spent a day in prison before the magistrate ordered him to leave Lausanne. But Switzerland was also the university he could not afford. He attended the lectures of economist Vilfredo Pareto at the University of Lausanne, whose lessons marked him forever. Pareto argued that history was not the inevitable result of economic forces, as Marx insisted, but a series of accidents produced by individuals with the capacity to seize every shift of the wind. Successful leadership, in Pareto's view, consisted of adjusting course rapidly in the face of every new current. Mussolini absorbed it all. His enemies would call him an opportunist and traitor of 1,000 ideologies. In his head, he was simply an exemplary pupil of Pareto. In Zurich, he met Angelika Balabanov, a small hunchbacked woman with a harsh voice who was the soul and driving force of the Russian conspirators in Switzerland. She spoke 6 languages, knew Lenin and Trotsky, and was Mussolini's political mentor for 10 years. One night in a cafe, while the 3 Russians watched him as if he were not present, Balabanov analyzed him aloud. "His weakness is that he is a revolutionary, only because he hates being poor, not out of genuine sympathy with the working class. And he is too excitable, too neurotic." Lenin nodded. Trotsky adjusted his thick glasses. "Why then do you bother with him?" Balabanov replied, "He has fire, eloquence, and leadership ability." Mussolini listened, ate hungrily, and said nothing. They expelled him from 2 cantons for inflammatory speeches. He forged his passport. They deported him to the Italian border. He returned to Italy in 1904, protected by the amnesty that Victor Emmanuel III had granted to deserters and political exiles, and completed his mandatory military service in the 10th Bersaglieri Regiment in Verona, the elite of Italian infantry, known for their green rooster feathers on their hat and their double-time march. He was, according to his own account, a model soldier. His officers could not believe that the agitator whose file made them frown became the most disciplined soldier in the company. He did not finish service. His mother, Rosa, fell gravely ill, and they granted him leave. He arrived in time to see his mother's head tilt slowly and die. Rosa Mussolini was under 48 years old. It was the hardest blow of his life, the only grief that brought him down without resources. For days, he could not get up from the chair in front of the fireplace, drinking wine with his father and his brother Arnaldo in the silence of the extinguished forge. The Journalist of Violence, From Avanti to Popolo d'Italia. In 1912, at 29 years of age, Benito Mussolini was appointed editor of the Avanti newspaper, Italy's only socialist daily, published in Milan. It was the most important position the Socialist Party could offer. Within a few months, he tripled circulation to exceed 100,000 copies, but August 1914 changed everything. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo sparked the First World War, and the Italian Socialist Party adopted a stance of absolute neutrality. Mussolini, on the other hand, concluded that Italy must intervene alongside the allies of the Triple Entente to end the German and Austro-Hungarian empires and liberate the northern territories that still spoke Italian under foreign rule. On November 25, 1914, before a party hall packed with 3,000 furious militants in Milan, he was expelled from Avanti and the Socialist Party. The shouts drowned him out. He waited standing on the podium until he could speak. "Believing that you take away my membership card, you also take away my faith. But you haven't seen the last of me." He stepped down from the podium as the hall roared. Weeks later, he founded Popolo d'Italia. The first funds came from sources he would always deny, but which history documented decades later. French and Russian industrial funds interested in getting Italy into the war. The newspaper bore a subtitle that said it all: Socialist Daily. In its pages, he wrote some of the most ardent lines of Italian journalism of the time. "Long live the war, long live Italy's war, long live war in general. Peace is absurd, or rather, a pause in war." In May 1915, Italy entered the war, and Mussolini, consistent, was called to arms. He served 9 months on the front line in the Carso, the limestone karsts to the northeast, one of the most bloody fronts of the war. He reached corporal. On February 23, 1917, a mortar accident during training exercises severely wounded him, with 40 shrapnel fragments in his body, some so deep they could never be extracted. They operated on him without anesthesia on at least 12 different occasions. He was discharged in August 1917 and returned to Popolo d'Italia. The war had given him something no course in oratory could teach: real authority. He had been in the trenches. He had seen men die. When he spoke of sacrifice and blood, there was a physical veracity in his words that salon orators could not emulate. Italy emerged from the war with 600,000 dead and a victory that the whole world called mutilated. In the 1919 peace treaties, England and France ignored the promises they had made for Italy to enter the war. Dalmatia went to Yugoslavia, Fiume remained in dispute, and the promised African colonies never arrived. The outrage was deep and widespread. On that humus of humiliation, Mussolini planted his seed. The Fasci and the March on Rome, the rise to power. On March 23, 1919, at No. 9 Piazza San Sepolcro in Milan, Mussolini convened a meeting of veterans, revolutionary trade unionists, and adventurers of all kinds. Most bore the marks of war: scars, mutilated limbs, eyes looking with the specific stillness of those who have been too close to death. He called them to constitute the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, the Association of Italian Combatants. Their flag would be the insignia of the Arditi, the elite shock troops of the war, white skull on a black background. Their uniform, the black shirt of the Romagna workers. Their emblem, the fasces, a bundle of rods tied around an axe, the symbol of the power of Roman magistrates. All present stood up and swore allegiance. The elected secretary was Cesare Rossi, a former trade unionist. Among the other members of the executive committee that Mussolini selected that afternoon, according to later testimonies by Rossi himself, at least 2 had criminal records. The Fasci were not a political party in the conventional sense. They were a shock force. Groups of armed blackshirts, the squadristi, began attacking socialist and trade union headquarters throughout northern Italy. The police invariably arrived late, when the fascists had already fled and only the wounded remained. Giolitti's government, fearful of Bolshevism, looked the other way, or, worse still, as Mussolini later revealed, went so far as to secretly offer the support of the Carabinieri to the fascists in exchange for Mussolini breaking with D'Annunzio. Gabriele D'Annunzio, the poet-warrior, was the great romantic figure of Italian irredentism. In September 1919, at the head of a handful of Arditi, he had occupied Fiume and claimed it for Italy. The feat made the nation vibrate. Mussolini hurried to jump on the bandwagon of D'Annunzio's popularity, but when Giolitti blocked Fiume and the poet had to surrender in December 1920, Mussolini did not come to his rescue. He no longer needed him. In the elections of May 1921, Mussolini presented a list of 34 fascist candidates. They all won, along with control of Milan, Bologna, and Ferrara. From 4,000 humiliating votes in 1919, he went to 178,000. At the head of the Fascist Congress of Naples in October 1922, with 30,000 black shirts marching before him in Piazza del Plebiscito amid bugles and flags, he launched the ultimatum. Either the government is handed over to us, or we take it by marching on Rome. On October 27th, 3 columns of squadristi began to converge on the capital from different directions. Prime Minister Luigi Facta asked the king for the declaration of martial law. Victor Emmanuel III, 52 years old, fearful of civil war, refused to sign. It was a decision that sealed Italy's fate for 23 years. Mussolini waited in his office in Milan. The call from the king's aide-de-camp arrived. His Majesty invited him to Rome to form a government. He called the editorial office of Popolo d'Italia. "Stop the presses, a new headline, Mussolini, new Prime Minister." He took the night train. He arrived in Rome wearing his black shirt, excused himself to the king. "I come straight from the battlefield." Fascist troops entered Rome on October 30th, 1922, in a triumphant 5-hour march in front of the royal palace. Mussolini was 39 years old. It had worked. The man who slept under a bridge in Lausanne with a Marx medal in his pocket was now the Prime Minister of Italy. Il Duce, construction of the dictatorship. Mussolini came to the head of the government without any concrete program. He admitted it with characteristic brutality. "Imbeciles always ask for programs. Our program is simple. We want to govern Italy." The only coherent ideology he had was power, and the immediate task was to consolidate it. He did it with a methodology that a young agitator from Munich would observe with disgust mixed with admiration. Step by step, without rushing, eliminating every lever of the Free State and replacing it with a fascist gear. First, visible loyalty. On the very day of his first cabinet, he appointed representatives of all parties as ministers, so as not to frighten the king or the moderates. But he reserved for himself the portfolios of President of the Council, Minister of the Interior, and Minister of Foreign Affairs. 3 ministries in a single person. Real power, undivided. Then, force. The squadristi were converted into the Milizia Volontaria per la Sicurezza Nazionale, the national militia, financed by the state but loyal only to the Duce. 150,000 armed men who did not answer to the royal army or parliament. They were his private army, legalized, afterwards systematized political violence. Cesare Rossi organized the Cheka, the fascist secret police, explicitly inspired by the Soviet one. Its operatives received lists of citizens marked for assault, torture, or murder. Throughout Italy, men were murdered in streets, hospitals, classrooms, and prisons. Officials who had criticized Mussolini were stripped and paraded through the squares. Castor oil was used to humiliate opponents. It was poured into them by force through a funnel while the subject was immobilized. On June 10, 1924, Socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti was kidnapped on a street in Rome by 5 men who forced him into a car. Matteotti had delivered the most devastating opposition speech to the regime days earlier, documenting electoral fraud, the crimes of the Cheka, and secret agreements with industrialists. His body was found buried 12 kilometers from Rome 12 days after the kidnapping. The leader of the kidnappers was Amerigo Dumini, a criminal of American origin who used to introduce himself as Dumini, 11 murders. Outrage was total. The 5 main opposition parties abandoned parliament in what they called the Aventine, emulating the plebeians of ancient Rome. Posters with Mussolini's image were torn down or painted with the word assassin. Cardinal Maffei of Pisa telegraphed, "As a priest I weep, as an Italian I am ashamed." Corriere della Sera demanded immediate resignation. Mussolini was on the verge of collapse. For the first time since he had power, he feared losing it. But the opposition made the fatal mistake of believing that simply leaving Parliament was enough for the king to act. Victor Emmanuel did not act, and Mussolini survived. On January 3, 1925, he took the podium in Parliament and delivered the boldest speech of his career. "If fascism has been an association of criminals, I am the head of those criminals. The political, moral, historical responsibility is mine. Italy wants peace and tranquility, work and calm. We will give it to them with love if possible, with force if necessary." That very afternoon, he telegraphed the prefects throughout Italy. Within 48 hours, they were to destroy all opposition parties, newspapers, and organizations that were still functioning. The dictatorship was official. The totalitarian state, the Italy Mussolini built. Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. It was the phrase Mussolini used in 1925 to describe what he wanted to build, and he was also the first modern dictator to adopt the term totalitarian as something positive, as an aspiration. Between 1925 and 1929, he systematically dismantled every institution that could become a counterweight. Independent unions were replaced by fascist unions without the right to strike. The press was subjected to total censorship. Journalists received daily instruction sheets on which topics to cover and in what tone. The judicial apparatus was reorganized to include a special tribunal for the defense of the state, before which opponents accused of crimes against the fascist nation appeared. The Ovra, heir to the Cheka but legalized, grew to have more than 100,000 operatives among secret and uniformed agents who monitored the population. Building concierges were legally obligated to spy on tenants. Neighbors were incentivized to denounce each other. But Mussolini also built, and this ambivalence is central to understanding why millions of Italians followed him for 2 decades. He built roads, schools, hospitals, bridges, low-cost housing, factories. He drained marshes, modernized the railways, raised agricultural production. He introduced unemployment insurance, maternity benefits, the 8-hour workday, and the 40-hour week in a country where workers had been subjected to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. When Mussolini presented these measures to the Association of Italian Industrialists, they shouted, "Communism." He replied, "No, syndicalism. If I control the workers from above, you will never again need to fear their unions or their strikes." The leader of the industrialists extended his hand. "Mussolini, you are a genius." He organized the Dopolavoro, a network of workers' clubs that provided sports, outdoor cinema, theaters, excursions, sports facilities. At the peak of its popularity, the Dopolavoro had millions of members and was the largest recreational institution in Europe. The Balilla was the other piece of the puzzle, a mandatory youth organization for children from 6 to 16 years old, dressed in black shirts, trained in military exercises, indoctrinated in the glory of Rome and the greatness of Il Duce. "Book and rifle, perfect fascist," was the motto. Mussolini understood something that later dictators would copy: control of childhood guaranteed control of the future. In 1929, he signed the Lateran Pacts with the Vatican, which recognized Vatican City as an independent state and established Catholicism as the official religion of Italy. In exchange, the Pope legitimized the regime. Cardinal Pacelli, future Pius XII, went so far as to call Mussolini the most cultured restorer of imperial Rome. It was the greatest blow of religious legitimacy that any Italian secular government had received since unification. The motto, painted in black letters on all the walls, breakwaters, and mountain slopes of Italy, summed up the project: "Believe, obey, fight." He ordered it fixed in every corner of the country with the persistence of someone who knows that repetition is the mother of conviction. Il Mare Nostrum, Imperialism and the African Dream. In 1927, Mussolini spoke to Parliament with a phrase that defined his vision: Italy must have ready the capacity to mobilize 5 million men. It was a nation with 40 million inhabitants, without sufficient raw materials, without profitable colonies imprisoned in the Mediterranean. Its outlet was expansion. The first move was diplomatic. Albania was converted into an Italian satellite through the Treaty of Tirana of 1926 without firing a single shot. King Zog signed the treaties handing over to Italy de facto control of Albanian foreign policy in exchange for financial and military support. It was a clean victory of the kind Mussolini preferred before 1935, conquests that did not cost visible Italian blood, but the blood would come. In October 1935, he appeared on the balcony of Palazzo Venezia in full dress uniform to announce that Italy was declaring war on Ethiopia, which he continued to call by its ancient name, Abyssinia. The reasons were varied and intertwined. A historical defeat had weighed on Italy since 1896. At Adwa, the army of General Oreste Baratieri had been annihilated by the troops of Negus Menelik II in the greatest colonial defeat of a European power in Africa. 40 years later, Italy wanted to wash away that affront, and Mussolini also needed a safety valve for an economy that was beginning to struggle, a colony where he could relocate the million Italians he considered surplus, and above all, a military victory that would demonstrate to the world and to his own people that fascist Italy was a first-rate power. The designated commander was General Emilio de Bono, a veteran of the First World War and one of the quadrumvirs of the March on Rome. Mussolini hung a huge map of Ethiopia on the wall of Villa Torlonia and spent hours moving little flags, sending contradictory telegrams to de Bono that left him paralyzed. The advance was slow. The international press began to mock. In December 1935, he replaced de Bono with Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who was what de Bono was not, a professional with no patience for telegrams from Rome. When Mussolini kept sending them, Badoglio crumpled them up with a gesture of disdain and famously replied, "Leave me in peace if you want a victory." Badoglio obtained it, but not without costing Italy's international reputation what Mussolini had won politically. Italian artillery fired shells with mustard gas on the troops of Negus Haile Selassie, causing over 30,000 casualties among Ethiopian soldiers. Airplanes bombed and strafed tents flying the Swedish Red Cross. Sweden protested formally. Italy responded with sarcasm. Should our pilots fill the bombs with eau de cologne? On May 1, 1936, Haile Selassie escaped on a British cruiser. Mussolini announced the conquest. "The days of the Caesars have returned," he shouted from the balcony of Palazzo Venezia, while the crowd roared, "Duce Emperor, Duce Emperor." Badoglio was named Viceroy of Ethiopia and Duke of Addis Ababa. Mussolini self-proclaimed himself First Marshal of the Empire of Italy, expropriating the only title that by tradition belonged to King Victor Emmanuel. The monarch bit his lip. He would never forgive that humiliation. The conquest of Ethiopia was actually the point where the fall began. The League of Nations voted economic sanctions against Italy, which Laval of France undertook to empty of content through the back door. But the episode alienated Italy from France and Great Britain and pushed it closer to the Germany of Adolf Hitler, which since January 1933 had governed the most powerful country on the European continent. The Rome-Berlin Axis, the alliance that condemned him. The first time Mussolini and Hitler met was in June 1934 at Villa di Stra near Venice. Mussolini arrived in fascist uniform. Hitler arrived in a civilian suit and trench coat. They stayed together for several days. Mussolini left the meeting convinced that Hitler was, as he told Rachele afterwards, a genuine madman. Wild ideas pour from his mouth one after another, and he is obsessed with that German mania, anti-Semitism. But the dynamics of power have their own logic. A month after the meeting, Austrian Nazis assassinated Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, a personal friend of Mussolini. Il Duce moved 2 Italian divisions to the Brenner border as a warning to Hitler not to try to occupy Austria. It was the moment when he could have broken with Germany definitively. Instead, he awaited a signal of support from London and Paris that never came. "They have disappointed me," he told Rachele bitterly. Their apathy may encourage Hitler. The chain of events that followed unfolded with relentless logic. The conquest of Ethiopia and the League of Nations sanctions had deteriorated relations with Western democracies. Hitler offered supportive backing to Italy when everyone was condemning it. In October 1936, Italy and Germany formalized the Rome-Berlin Axis. In September 1937, Mussolini visited Berlin and was intimidated by the parade of the German war machine. The Panzers, the Stukas, the Wehrmacht regiments marching with a mechanical precision that fascist Italy could not even dream of replicating. He returned from Berlin depressed. He was no longer the master. The pupil had overwhelmingly surpassed him. He confessed to Galeazzo Ciano, his son-in-law and foreign minister, "We have no choice. We simply do not have anywhere near Germany's strength. Our only real protection against a German invasion lies in being allies with Germany." It was an admission of weakness he would not have made to anyone else. The Pact of Steel, signed on May 22, 1939, was the formalization of what had become inevitable. Italy and Germany committed to supporting each other in the event of war, regardless of circumstances. It was Ciano who understood the trap. With this pact, Mussolini has handed Italy over to Hitler. The decision to go to war or not is no longer ours. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. Mussolini, who was not militarily prepared, declared Italian non-belligerence, a stance that satisfied no one. It was not neutrality, which would have given him a certain independence, but a limbo that highlighted his dependence on German successes to enter the conflict at the moment he deemed most advantageous. The moment he deemed most advantageous arrived on June 10, 1940. France was on its knees. German troops had entered Paris 4 days earlier. Mussolini bet that England would follow France into capitulation. That afternoon he declared war on Great Britain and France from the balcony of Palazzo Venezia. Winston Churchill, who had just taken office as Prime Minister of Great Britain, told Parliament that in no country in the world had such a grave decision been made with so little reflection. The bet was the most disastrous of his life. The parallel war, the defeats no one expected. In June 1940, the state of the Italian army was the worst-kept secret in Europe. Its military leaders knew it. Its own marshals knew it. Mussolini suspected it, but preferred to ignore it. On paper, Italy had an army of millions of men. The reality was different. Most Italian divisions existed only as names on staff lists. They lacked basic equipment, sufficient motorization, modern artillery. Troops rarely had enough water in Africa. They often lacked working radios. The Regia Aeronautica operated largely with biplane aircraft that British, Canadian and Australian pilots of the Hurricane and Spitfire catalogued as antiquated at best. The Regia Marina, the most modern branch of the Italian armed forces, lacked aircraft carriers and radar, a detail that underlined the technological gap. While the Royal Navy had equipped most of its large warships with surface and air radar systems since 1939, there was not a single radar detector in the entire Italian fleet when the war began in June 1940. In North Africa, Mussolini ordered Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, commander of the Italian 10th Army in Libya, to advance into Egypt. Graziani knew it was a reckless maneuver. He had communicated in writing to Rome that his army lacked the necessary motorization to sustain an offensive in the desert. 4/5 of his divisions were foot infantry in a theater where war was essentially one of movement and where distances between water points measured hundreds of kilometers. Mussolini ignored him. In September 1940, he crossed the border with 80,000 men, advanced about 90 kilometers to the coastal town of Sidi Barrani in Egyptian territory, and stopped. 7 scattered camps were built in the desert. The troops waited. Graziani telegraphed Rome that logistics were impossible to continue forward without a consolidation period of several weeks. In December 1940, General Richard O'Connor, launched Operation Compass with barely 36,000 men of the British Western Desert Force. In 2 months, it destroyed 2 complete Italian armies. By February 1941, 133,000 Italian soldiers had been captured, and the rest had been pushed almost to Tripoli, 1,300 kilometers away. The speed of the collapse took even the British themselves by surprise, who stopped their advance not because of Italian resistance, but because Whitehall decided to send troops to Greece. Hitler had to send Erwin Rommel with the Afrika Korps to prevent the Italians from losing all of Libya. In Greece, the situation was worse in terms of prestige. Mussolini invaded from Albania on October 28, 1940, without informing Hitler in advance. "Hitler always presents me with fait accompli," he had told Ciano. "This time I will present him with one." The Greeks resisted with a ferocity the Italians had not anticipated. By the end of November, they had not only halted the invasion in the mountains of Epirus, but had pushed the Italians back into Albania, recovering up to a quarter of the Albanian territory previously controlled by the Italians. By December 1940, the Greeks had taken the city of Gjirokastra. In early 1941, the situation was so critical that Mussolini had to send urgent reinforcements and relieve General Sebastiano Visconti Prasca, who had planned the operation, with Marshal Ugo Cavallero. The world press ridiculed the debacle. Hitler had to interrupt his preparations for Barbarossa and allocate additional forces to the Balkans in the spring of 1941 to rescue his ally, which, according to several German historians, delayed the start of the invasion of the Soviet Union by several crucial weeks. In Italian East Africa, comprising Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland, the picture was equally grim. The Italians theoretically had more than 350,000 men there under the command of the Duke of Aosta, Amedeo di Savoia-Aosta. But the vast majority were colonial troops with outdated weaponry, and regular Italian forces lacked the logistical support to sustain prolonged operations far from their bases. British attacks from Sudan and Kenya began in January 1941. By May, Italian forces had been completely defeated. The Duke of Aosta surrendered the last stronghold at Amba Alagi on May 16, 1941, with the honours of war, in one of the few honourable capitulations of the entire Italian campaign. At sea, the Royal Navy launched the attack on Taranto on the night of November 11 to 12, 1940. 21 Swordfish biplane torpedo bombers, launched from the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious, attacked in 2 waves the Italian naval base where the bulk of the fleet was anchored. They sank the battleship Conte di Cavour, severely damaged the Littorio and the Caio Duilio, and temporarily put out of action 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers, all at the cost of 2 planes shot down. Admiral Yamamoto studied the attack closely before planning Pearl Harbor. In March 1941, the Battle of Cape Matapan cost the Regia Marina 3 heavy cruisers, the Zara, the Pola, and the Fiume, and 2 destroyers sunk in a single nocturnal encounter in which the British used their radar to position themselves for a firing position without being detected. The Regia Marina would never again be an effective offensive force for the entire war. On the Eastern Front, the deterioration was equally catastrophic. The Italian Expeditionary Corps, sent in June 1941 with 3 divisions and 62,000 men under the command of General Francesco Zingales, progressively expanded to become the Armia, the Italian army in Russia, with 8 divisions and more than 200,000 men in the autumn of 1942. Italian divisions on the Eastern Front lacked adequate anti-tank weapons to face Soviet T-34s. Their 47mm guns were effective against light tanks, but practically useless against the T-34's armor. Many of their vehicles had no heating. In the Russian winter of 1942 to 1943, with temperatures reaching 45 degrees below zero, motor oils froze and engines would not start. The boots of Italian soldiers, designed for the Mediterranean, were unsuited for the Russian steppe. During the Soviet counter-offensive of November 1942, which sealed the encirclement of Stalingrad, the Italian lines on the Don were broken in the operation named Little Saturn. Between December 1942 and January 1943, the Armia was virtually destroyed. Records of the Italian Ministry of Defense published decades later put total losses at around 130,000 men among dead, wounded and captured, although broader estimates reach higher figures. Survivors made a foot retreat of hundreds of kilometers in the dead of winter, and those who returned to Italy recounted the horror of Soviet armored attacks on lines that had only previous war rifles and uninsulated trenches. A surviving soldier, Eugenio Corti, would document this years later in his testimony, I più non ritornano. It was the rout, the end of the world, the great return we had all feared. On December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Mussolini and Hitler jointly declared war on the United States of America. It was a decision Mussolini made out of pure loyalty to the German ally, and the calculation that the Americans would be too busy with Japan to intervene decisively in Europe in the short term. It was a mistake of historic proportions. 4 months later, General George Marshall began sending the first American troops to Great Britain. 18 months later, those troops would land on the beaches of Sicily. And with that, the illusion of the parallel war that Mussolini had dreamed of, a Mediterranean and imperial war apart from the major European conflicts, where Italy could shine with its own light, was definitively buried under the sand of the Libyan desert, the snow of the Russian steppe, and the depths of the Mediterranean. Sicily 1943, the invasion that sealed Italy's fate. In May 1943, after 6 months of the Tunisian campaign, Axis forces in Africa surrendered. More than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner at Cap Bon, including General Jürgen von Arnim. It was the greatest Axis disaster since Stalingrad. The Allies now had dominance of the Mediterranean. The next question was where to strike the next blow in Europe. Sicily was the logical answer. Barely 140 kilometers of channel separated Tunis from the island, and Sicily was Italy, the first crack in Fortress Europe. Operation Husky, the code name for the invasion of Sicily, was approved at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. The supreme commander would be General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ground forces, under the command of General Sir Harold Alexander, were divided into 2 armies. General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army and General George S. Patton's U.S. 7th Army. The chosen date was July 10, 1943. The defense of Sicily was theoretically entrusted to 200,000 Italian soldiers, reinforced by 2 German divisions, the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and the Hermann Göring Panzer Division. The German general in charge of coordinating the defense, the eccentric Oberst Ernst Günther Bader, known for his Scottish kilt and claymore, was a figure who commanded respect among his own troops, but operated within an Italian-German command system that never ceased functioning with constant friction and mutual distrust. Holland describes in Sicily 43 the strategic dilemma. The triangular island, dominated in the northeast by the 3,340-meter Mount Etna volcano, had airfields in the north, south and center. The ultimate objective was Messina, in the strait separating Sicily from the Italian mainland, through which all Axis supplies and reinforcements flowed. But Messina was heavily defended, difficult to access, and out of range of air cover from Malta and Tunis. The final plan, after months of disputes among Allied commanders in which Montgomery played a disruptive yet ultimately constructive role, concentrated forces on the southern and southeastern coast. The 8th Army would land in the Avola and Syracuse area, and the 7th Army at Gela and Licata. The operation required 2,590 transport and warships, 4,000 aircraft and 160,000 troops in the initial wave. The night of July 9th to 10th was violent. Mediterranean winds, reaching nearly 45 kilometers per hour, shattered many of the paratrooper and glider formations. The British 1st Parachute Brigade and the American 82nd Airborne Division were scattered over tens of kilometers. Many fell into the sea. Others landed miles away from their objectives. But dawn broke on July 10th, and soldiers began to land. Italian troops on the beaches were generally the weakest part of the defense. Many of the soldiers were Sicilians who had seen their land bombed for years and whose families lived under Allied fire. Those who put up tenacious resistance were minorities. Most Sicilian commanders, as Holland records, reported that mainland Italians had more will to fight than local soldiers. An Italian stronghold at Ponte di Rilo resisted for several days. Others collapsed with a rapidity that the Germans themselves considered shameful. The Germans fought differently. The Hermann Göring division counterattacked at Gela on July 11th with Tiger and Panzer IV tanks. At one point, General Terry de la Mesa Allen's Americans had tanks less than 2 kilometers from the landing beaches. Artillerymen of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and naval gunfire from the cruiser USS Brooklyn halted the counterattack. It was one of the most critical moments of the entire operation. 38 days after the landings, on August 17, 1943, the last German soldier crossed the Strait of Messina to the Italian mainland. The Battle of Sicily was over. The Allies had conquered the island, but the defeat in Sicily already had a consequence that had preceded it by 3 weeks. The fall of Il Duce, the night of July 25, 1943. In the years leading up to World War II, Mussolini's relationship with reality deteriorated gradually and inexorably. Generals who brought him bad news learned it was better not to bring it. Ministers pointing out the limitations of Italian resources were ignored or replaced. Il Duce had surrounded himself with sycophants who confirmed his illusions, and the illusions had taken control. But in the summer of 1943, realities were too brutal to ignore. The Allies had landed in Sicily. Rome had been bombed on July 19, 1943, the first time the Italian capital suffered a massive air attack. 1,000 Allied bombers unloaded their payloads on the San Lorenzo railway junction and surrounding neighborhoods. More than 2,000 people died. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. The Basilica of San Lorenzo fuori le Mura, one of the oldest churches in Christendom, was severely damaged. Crowds in the streets were not shouting "Duce" but demanding peace. The very pillars of the regime were cracking. The Grand Council of Fascism, which Mussolini had turned into a purely decorative body for years, was convened for July 24th. Historians have debated for decades how much Mussolini knew of what was going to happen at that meeting. Galeazzo Ciano, his own son-in-law, had been in talks with the groups planning the motion of no confidence. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who would replace him, had been contacted by the conspirators weeks earlier. King Victor Emmanuel, the monarch Mussolini had humiliated and ignored for years, was aware. The Grand Council meeting began at 5 p.m. on July 24th and lasted until 2 a.m. on July 25th. Deputy Dino Grandi presented a motion asking Mussolini to return command of the armed forces to the king and for the Grand Council to recover its constitutional powers. It was a motion of no confidence, formulated in the bureaucratic language of institutional restoration. Mussolini spoke for 2 hours. It was the oratory of a man who had lost his edge, repetitive, defensive, lacking the energy that had made him legendary. The motion was voted on at 2 a.m. on July 25th. 19 votes in favor, 7 against, 1 abstention. Galeazzo Ciano voted against his father-in-law. The next day, July 25, 1943, Mussolini went to the royal palace to inform the king. Victor Emmanuel was waiting for him in the garden. It was a brief conversation. "The situation is irreparable," the king told him, according to Badoglio's later memoirs. "At this moment, I am the most hated man in Italy." Mussolini replied, "They have voted against me." The king announced that he had designated Marshal Pietro Badoglio as the new head of government. As he left the palace, a carabinieri captain approached Mussolini with a courteous gesture. He had orders to accompany him. They placed him in an ambulance. He was transferred to the island of Ponza and then to Hotel Campo Imperatore, high on the Gran Sasso Massif in the Apennines, at an altitude of 2,130 meters. When the radio announced Mussolini's arrest that night on July 25th, the Italian people took to the streets to celebrate. In Milan, in Rome, in Naples, crowds toppled statues of Il Duce, burned fascist party headquarters and ripped government emblems off public buildings. The joy was that of someone believing the war was over. It was not over. It had entered its bloodiest phase for Italy. The armistice and the betrayal, Italy between two fires, Badoglio announced that the war continues. It was what he had to say to avoid provoking an immediate German military response, although in his office he had already sent secret emissaries to the Allies to negotiate. The phrase fooled no one, neither the Germans, who began reinforcing their troops in Italy through the Brenner Pass at a rate of 1 division per week, nor the Allies, who knew Italy wanted out of the war. General Giuseppe Castellano, a young and brilliant general staff officer, travelled to Madrid and then Lisbon under a false passport in the name of Raymond Imas to make contact with the Allies. He met with the British ambassador to Spain, Sir Samuel Hoare, on August 15, 1943. The Italian situation was desperate. The Germans had already brought 13 divisions to Italy, and more were arriving. The Italian army, though numerous on paper, was poorly equipped and its morale was a disaster. The Regia Aeronautica had practically ceased to exist as a combat force. Italy needed the Allies to land with sufficient force on the peninsula so that Italian troops could switch sides and fight alongside them against the Germans. The Allies agreed to negotiate, but under very harsh conditions. The armistice, known as the Armistice of Cassibile, was secretly signed on September 3rd, 1943, the very day Montgomery's Eighth Army crossed the Strait of Messina and set foot on the Italian mainland with Operation Baytown. 6 days later, on September 8th at 6:30 p.m., radio loudspeakers across Italy broadcast Badoglio's voice. The Italian government, recognizing the impossibility of continuing the unequal struggle against the overwhelming power of the adversary, with the purpose of sparing the nation further and more serious disasters, has asked for an armistice to General Eisenhower. The popular reaction was jubilation. The German military reaction was immediate and calculated. Hitler had anticipated the Italian betrayal. Operation AXA, the German plan to disarm Italian forces in the event of a change of alliance, was executed with brutal efficiency. Within hours, in Italy, the Balkans, Greece, Corsica, and throughout the Mediterranean area, German units surrounded and disarmed Italian divisions. In many cases there was resistance, and the Germans responded without mercy. The Acqui Division, on the island of Kefalonia, resisted for 9 days in open combat against the 1st German Mountain Division. When it fell, the Germans executed more than 4,000 Italian prisoners, including General Antonio Gandin. It was one of the most massive war crimes of the Mediterranean theatre. In Rome, the king and Badoglio fled south in the early hours of September 9th. They gave no instructions to military commanders on what they should do. The abandonment of the capital was total and shameful. The generals who were supposed to defend the city did not know whether they should fight or surrender, nor against whom the former was possible. German divisions occupied Rome on September 10th. That same morning of September 9th, at 3:30 a.m., the first soldiers of the U.S. Fifth Army under General Mark Clark began landing on the beaches of the Gulf of Salerno in Operation Avalanche. It was the great Allied gamble, a landing 300 kilometers north of the Strait of Messina, designed to capture Naples, the largest port in southern Italy, and advance toward Rome. The Savage Storm, the Battle of Italy. The Germans knew the exact location of the Allied landing at Salerno almost from the first moment. General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, commander of the German 10th Army, responded with a speed that caught the Allies unprepared. German armoured divisions, including the 16th Panzer Division, launched counterattacks that for 3 days brought the situation to the brink of collapse. September 13th, 1943, was the worst day of the Salerno campaign. German panzers advanced to within less than 3 kilometers of the sea. General Clark even considered the possibility of a partial re-embarkation. Allied engineers received orders to prepare Plan B for an emergency evacuation. James Holland describes in The Savage Storm that Italy of the autumn of 1943 as a broken country. Pasqualina Caruso, a 19-year-old Neapolitan girl, wrote in her diary on September 4, 1943, "Italy is already a land of the dead. We no longer laugh, we no longer sing, we no longer play, we no longer enjoy, we only weep and die." In Naples, which had been the third largest city in Italy, cooking gas had disappeared. There was no coal, no running water. Trucks distributed drinking water that was insufficient for the population, and crowds fought to get a litre. The Allied counter-offensive at Salerno was sustained by the most intense naval bombardment of the entire Italian campaign. The guns of the battleship HMS Warspite and the cruiser USS Philadelphia turned the terrain into a lunar landscape, and then reinforcing Allied divisions arrived and the Germans retreated northward. Naples fell on October 1, 1943. The arrival of Allied soldiers in a ruined and starving city was one of the most documented moments of the war. Children begged for food. Black markets flourished with the remnants of what the Germans had left behind. 4 days before the Allied arrival, the inhabitants of Naples had risen up spontaneously against the Germans in the so-called 4 Days of Naples, a popular uprising that cost hundreds of civilian lives but hastened the German retreat. The road north was blocked by a line of defences that Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of the Italian theatre, had built with a mastery that earned them the recognition of their own enemies. The Bernhard Line first, the Gustav Line later, cut across the Italian peninsula with a series of positions that took advantage of every mountain, every river, every village perched on a ridge. Monte Cassino, where the 6th century Benedictine abbey dominated the only route to Rome through the Liri Valley, became the symbol of that wall the Allies could not breach. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was the cruelest of the campaign. In the Abruzzi Mountains and along the Sangro Line, Allied and German soldiers faced sub-zero temperatures, rain turning to ice, mud that made vehicle movement impossible, and the physical misery of living in open trenches exposed to the winds of the Adriatic. One of the German commanders on that line, Lieutenant Hans Golder, heading a battery of Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, crossed the Strait of Messina in August 1943 with the bittersweet feeling of one who has survived a battle but knows more will come. In his notes, preserved and cited by Holland in The Savage Storm, he described the Italy through which he passed. Rosario was heavily destroyed. Palmi, once a charming port city, abandoned and dead. Houses shattered, streets ripped open by bombs. War had returned to continental Europe, and Italy was the battlefield. The Republic of Sals, the ghost of Il Duce. While the Allies fought for every hill in the south, Hitler had executed the most dramatic operation to rescue his ally. On September 12, 1943, a commando of German paratroopers under the command of SS Sturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny landed in gliders on top of the Gran Sasso, where Mussolini was imprisoned at Hotel Campo Imperatore. The Italian guards, confused and surprised, offered no resistance. Mussolini was put aboard a small Fieseler Storch aircraft and transferred first to Pratica di Mare and then to Germany, where Hitler welcomed him. The testimonies of those who saw Mussolini in those days agree in describing him as a destroyed man. He had aged visibly. His eyes, always described as vibrant and piercing, were dull. He barely spoke. A journalist to whom he granted a brief interview shortly before his death recorded the words he uttered himself. "I am finished. My star has fallen. I no longer have the strength to fight. I work and I try, but I know it is all a farce. I await the end of the tragedy, and strangely detached from everything, I no longer feel like an actor. I feel like the last of the spectators." Hitler did not let him fall. He needed him to maintain the fiction of an Allied fascist Italy that would justify the German occupation of the northern part of the country. Mussolini was installed as head of the Italian Social Republic, the RSI, also known as the Republic of Salo, from the town on Lake Garda, where it had its provisional headquarters. It was a puppet state without an army of its own worthy of the name, without real resources, watched at every step by Hitler's representatives. From Salo, Mussolini signed the executions of those who had voted against him in the Grand Council. Among them was Galeazzo Ciano, his own son-in-law and the father of his grandchildren. Ciano was shot on January 11, 1944, in Verona, along with 4 other members of the Grand Council. He died facing the firing squad, as he had requested to die looking at his assassins. Edda Mussolini, the Duce's daughter and Ciano's wife, tried to save her husband through a desperate negotiation. She offered Ciano's diaries in exchange for his life. The diaries contained compromising information about Germany. Himmler was tempted, but the fascist judicial procedure in Verona was faster than any negotiation. Edda fled to Switzerland with the diaries hidden in her coat. She never forgave her father. The RSY's National Republican Guard was the most active instrument of terror in northern Italy during 1943 to 1945, collaborating with the German SS in the persecution of Jews, the hunting of partisans, and the control of the civilian population. More than 8,000 Italian Jews were deported to the Reich's extermination camps. Most did not return. It was the blackest stain of the entire fascist period, and it happened precisely when the regime was already in its death throes and depended entirely on Germany. The partisans of northern Italy, organized into communist, socialist, action and Catholic brigades under the umbrella of the National Liberation Committee, grew in number and audacity throughout 1944. They sabotaged bridges, attacked convoys, and protected downed Allied pilots. The Germans and the RSY responded with a brutality that generated more partisans than it eliminated. The end of the dream. April 1945. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. In the east, the Red Army advanced from the Vistula to the Oder. In the west, the Allies had crossed the Rhine. In Italy, the American Fifth Army and the British Eighth Army prepared the final offensive from the lines of the Po and the Apennines. The RSY was already a corpse that didn't know it. On the afternoon of April 25, 1945, the National Liberation Committee of Northern Italy called a general insurrection. The partisans took Milan, Turin, and Genoa. The German garrisons, negotiating their surrender, offered no resistance. Mussolini tried to escape. On the night of April 25th, he crossed Lake Como toward Menaggio with a German convoy. He carried a suitcase with documents and his mistress, Claretta Petacci, who refused to abandon him. He was disguised in a Luftwaffe coat. In the early hours of April 27th, in the small village of Dongo on the western shore of Lake Como, a brigade of communist partisans stopped the German convoy to check it. A brigade member checked the rear guard car and recognized the man wrapped in the coat. Mussolini was identified and arrested. During the night of April 27th to 28th, Mussolini and Claretta Petacci were transferred to Villa Belmonte in Giulino di Mezzegra, a hamlet on the shores of Lake Como. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon on April 28th, they were taken out to a lane and shot. The executor was Luigi Longo, Commander Walter Audizio, known as the partisan Colonnello Valerio. Mussolini's corpse received at least 5 bullet wounds. That very night, the bodies of Mussolini, Claretta Petacci, and 15 other fascist hierarchs were transported by truck to Milan. In the early hours of April 29th, they were hung upside down, with butcher hooks, from the roof beams of a gas station in Piazzale Loreto. It was the same place where, 9 months earlier, the Germans had publicly hung the bodies of 15 partisans executed in reprisal. The crowd that gathered in Piazzale Loreto that morning unloaded upon the bodies all the rage accumulated from 20 years of dictatorship, 4 years of war, bombings, hunger and fear. They kicked them, spat on them. Someone fired their pistol at Mussolini's corpse as it already hung motionless. A woman fired 5 shots, one for each child killed in the war, she said. 2 days later, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in the Berlin bunker. The final tally, what remained of an imperial dream. What did Italian fascism leave behind? The figures are cold but necessary. Italy lost between 450,000 and 500,000 soldiers on all fronts during the war. Civilian casualties in Italian territory during the 1943 to 1945 operations are estimated between 100,000 and 150,000 people. Southern cities were destroyed in proportions varying from partial damage to total devastation. Naples, Cassino, Foggia, Catanzaro, and Reggio Calabria were bombed into rubble in certain areas. The north, with the resistance and German reprisals, added a dimension of civilian terror from which the south had been spared. The Italian economy was in ruins. Infrastructure, from roads to railways, had been systematically destroyed by the Germans in their retreat. Bridges blown up, archives looted, machinery dismantled and sent to the Reich. Italian writer and politician Luigi Barzini Jr., who had known the regime and suffered under it, summarized it with a harshness worth remembering. Fascism had created an imaginary Spartan country in which all men had to pretend to be heroic soldiers, all women Roman matrons, all children Balila. This was done through slogans, flags, incendiary speeches from balconies, military music, mass rallies, parades, flashy uniforms, medals, deception, and constant distortions of reality. Italians woke up too late from their artificial dream. Those who were still alive, hungry, desperate, discredited. 8,564 Italian Jews were deported to Nazi extermination camps. Fewer than 1,000 survived. The man who started it all, the boy who received a punch from Orsi Giacona in a grape field in Dovia in 1890, lay hanging from a hook in Milan. His father Alessandro had taught him never to bend before the biggest bully. But the biggest bully of all had been himself, and the world he claimed to dominate had bent him with a violence that matched his own. The Italian fascist experiment lasted 23 years. It began with the promise of restoring the greatness of Rome and ended in Piazzale Loreto, with a man who had confused power with history and violence with force. There is a distinction between those two things that the blacksmith's son from Predappio never fully understood. Or perhaps he understood it too late, there at Villa Belmonte on the shores of Lake Como, on the afternoon of April 28, 1945, when the path they took him out on was damp and the sun was already setting over the Alps.